Consumer Price Index has been released today, and it shows that inflation is still going strong, although its number at 8.3% for the month compared to last year is slightly lower than last month's 8.5%. The measurement is compared to what prices were at this time last year. So this month's 8.3% compared to last month's 8.5% may suggest some easing, although still high. However, there is this other number that's called the core price measure that omits grocery and gas prices. And it shows that inflation has increased from the previous month from 0.3% to 0.6%. Well, joining us to talk about all this stuff concerning inflation today is a good friend of this radio program, Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff is a professor of economics at New School University in New York. He is the host of the very popular TV and radio program, Economic Update, and he is also the founder of Democracy at Work. You can find his work there, democracyatwork.info. Professor Wolff, a very good morning to you, sir.
Thank you, Mitch. Very glad to be with you again.
So I was guilty there of just putting out a bunch of numbers and anticipating everybody was going to understand them, talking about both the consumer price index and then also this core price measure. What I just laid out there, what does that all mean?
Okay. First of all, I'm going to give you an answer, but I want to be transparent and have all your listeners understand that there has been and there continues to be all kinds of debate among economists about what these numbers mean, how best to measure them, how to interpret their implications for policy. So if you're not 100% clear, please understand nobody else is either, including all the experts, and I'm not exempted from that either. So I'm going to give you my understanding, but to be clear, it is not shared 100% by other people for a variety of reasons. Anyway, here's the basic notion. The government of the United States keeps track of what it calls a basket of commodities or a basket of consumer goods. And then literally it does, as you might expect, measure the price of them month by month in a variety of locations because things vary, to get a general sense, which is what the Consumer Price Index measures, of how prices are moving. It's an average, it's based on a bunch of observations, therefore it's subject to all of the problems that go with that. But it does, if you look at it over time, give you a sense at least of which way the wind is blowing. And so obviously over the last year, the inflation, the rise in prices has been documented month after month after month. So we can be pretty confident we're in an inflation. And if you take the official numbers, well, then it's in the neighborhood this last month and this month of about 8.3 to 8.5%. Variations from month to month don't mean much. You have to see a kind of trend. Then there is this notion that economists developed some years ago that some items are more volatile. That is, they bounce around in price more than others. Food and fuel are those, and so you can withhold them. In other words, exclude them, and then you get this thing called the core inflation. It's the same number excluding food and fuel because you want to get away from the bouncing to the more of the trend.
Kind of get rid of the outliers when you're examining some data.
That way. That's right. Now, there's a number of things to understand here. Number one, it's an average, which means you might be a person who, for whatever reason, tends to buy items whose price hasn't gone up so much versus a person who happens to have an appetite for food or clothing or shelter or any of the other items involved that tilts towards the ones that have risen more. In other words, remember what an average is. It means some people are not experiencing anything like an 8% increase, and other people are experiencing twice that. So because that's what an average does. So if your own experience is a little different from what you're hearing on the radio doesn't mean you're wrong or it's right or anything like that. It just means you got to remember what an average is. The second thing to keep in mind is that inflations mean we're looking at a decision somebody made. In other words, prices do not rise by themselves. There's a tendency in the media to deal with the inflation, like it's sort of a thunderstorm. It's not something we can make happen. It's not something at anyone's beck and call. It is some sort of thing that
the invisible hand of the market.
Yeah, that's right. Or the clouds, or if you're religious, well, you know where that could go. I want everyone to remember that an inflation only happens if the people who set prices raise them. Well, now, who sets prices? The answer, the class we call employers. If you've ever worked in a place as an employee, you probably noticed that among your job descriptions is not setting prices. You don't do that. You work there, you help make whatever they sell, but setting the price of whatever they sell, that's the prerogative of the owner of the business, of the employer, of the corporate board of directors, etc. And here's the point. A tiny minority of the people, if you added up all the employers in this country, you wouldn't get 1% of our population. So a tiny minority are actually making the decision to raise the price that we then notice when we measure inflation. So if you want to blame someone, if that's where you're going in your thinking, I can tell you who the people are who've raised the prices you're paying. They are the employers, a tiny minority. And you might want to wonder whether in a democratic society we ought to allow a tiny minority to have the power to set the price level that we can see has enormous impacts on all of us. Number one. So
can I unpack that? Can I ask you a question about that, though?
Please.
Because when we talk about employers, are we talking about all employers? Are we talking about a small set of employers? Because I know the local sandwich shop I go to, prices have gone up there. It's a small one shop, family owned, immigrant owned sandwich shop. They, and I believe them when they say, well, we were sort of forced to do it because the products the minimum wage has gone up, and the products that we are purchasing, the produce that we're buying, everything has gone up. So for us to be able to get by, we were forced to raise them.
Yes, they are absolutely right. I understand it, but I have to remind everyone, you can change the language there, and you can say, this employer, your sandwich shop owner, is responding to what other employers have done. In other words, he has to, or she have to pay more for everything that they buy, and they want to pass it on. In other words, one member of the employer class is responding to actions of other members of the employer class. Yes, they mention an increase in wages, but remember, wages is only one of a vast array of prices that every business pays. And of course, like with everything in America, the bigger the business, the richer the business, the more flexibility it has. It can absorb price increases of its inputs in a way that a small businessman or woman cannot possibly do, because the profit margin at the sandwich shop is small and doesn't leave much room. Whereas if we're talking about Apple computers or IBM or Amazon, then we're talking a wholly different thing. And there is an argument, as there always has been, that if you allow some businesses to be very big, then they will have, of course, an outsized influence. If they raise the price, everybody is affected. For example, if you're an oil company, Exxon, Chevron, any of them, you raise your prices, immediately everybody who drives a car, every business that has a fleet of trucks now has a higher price to pay. And so you can be more accountable for an inflation than a small business would be. All of that's true, but it doesn't basically change that it's the employer class, large and small. And by the way, many of the efforts to limit inflation come from little businesses precisely because of the story you just told, that they feel trapped. They can't survive unless they raise their price because they're dependent on the big companies they buy from who've raised their prices. And so they become, along with working people, the pressure to stop at inflation. And let me talk a little bit about that so people are clear. If you take a look at the first 3 months of this year, January, February, and March, the average increase in wages over those 3 months works out on an annual basis to about a 4% increase. In other words, prices are going up over 8%. Wages, on average, are going up over about 4%. That means that the working class is falling behind. The extra money you get, if you're lucky enough to get the average increase of 4%, still leaves you 4% less in terms of what you can afford to buy because all your prices have, on average, gone up by 8%. So the inflation, one of its big impacts is to damage the real income, the standard of living of the American working class, because our wages, on average up 4%, will not enable us to pay the higher prices because they're up by 8%. This is very, very bad for the working class as a whole. If you add that we've just come out of the worst public health disaster in our history and the second worst economic crash in our history in 2020 and 2021, to be hit with an inflation in 2022 is really a 1, 2, 3 punch that no working class should be have forced on it. And it is turning the mass of Americans into very upset, angry, anxious about their economic present and future. It is not good to be a sitting president like Mr. Biden at a time when the working class is being kicked around economics. Not that it's all his fault. It isn't. Much of this are trends that have been developing for years. But usually the population votes its feelings. And if you're the guy at the top when this kind of a story is happening, some of us are kind of amazed at how little the government seems to be able or willing to do, even to preserve itself in the face of these conditions. But if I may, Mitch,
can I just,
sure.
we will move on to the next point. I have not forgot, but there's a couple of, I do have a couple more questions about exactly what you're talking about. And I'll just give them both to you right now. One, the notion that the market will find the appropriate price for something because the employer or the owner will put out a price, and if people will pay for it, then that should be the price. If they don't, then they'll be forced to lower the price, or a competitor will undercut them. So that's one follow-up question. The other follow-up question I have is, aren't these large corporations that are setting the price legally bound to provide the largest potential profit for shareholders?
Yes, let me answer the second question first. The answer simply, yes, that's what capitalism is. It's a system that sets up the difference between an employer and an employee and has a structure that connects them one to the other. And the animating objective of those in control, the employers, they're the ones who decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, what to do with the profits. Their survival, their reward, their future, their career depends on making that enterprise profitable. That is, maximizing the difference between the revenue they get in from selling whatever they produce versus the costs they incur to carry out that production. That's the way the system works. So no question that that's what's going on. On your first point, the way that's taught to business school students is that you're always supposed to charge whatever price the market will bear. That's the phrase that's used. And so, yeah, you go out there and you charge as high a price as you can. Why? Well, it doesn't take rocket science. The higher the price you can charge, other things given, the bigger your profit. So if profit is what drives you, if profit going up gets you a reward and profit going down gets you a punishment, well, then we can expect the employers to do everything they can and motivate in every direction their decisions to go after what they call profit is our bottom line. Exactly. That's what you're focusing on. And setting the price is governed by profit maximization every bit as every other decision that a capitalist person makes in our society. So the honest answer to the question I raised at the beginning, why have prices gone up? The honest answer is because profit-driven employers see that as a profit-driving decision. They raise the price. Now, obviously, and you're quite right, if you raise the price so much that you can't sell what you've been producing, that's a clue, don't raise it that far, because you're shooting yourself in the foot. But let's be clear what that means. In an inflation, as you raise the price, you hope that even if you suffer some diminution in how many items you can sell because you've raised their price, you will still gain more by the rising price than you lose by the shortage of goods or the reduction in goods you can sell. And so you try to find the sweet spot where you can just raise it far enough. But now let's look at the buyer when this happens. When prices go up, you are allocating, you are distributing goods and services. Raising the price means that the person who cannot afford the higher price goes without, whereas the person who can afford the higher price continues to be a buyer because he can or she can. In other words, the market distributes goods according to your ability to afford them. Now, I do want to leave your listeners with a bit of a challenge. Their ethics, their morality is actually in play here, because I want you to ask with me the question, when things are relatively scarce and the price is driven up, or when they aren't scarce, but a businessman or woman simply wants to make more profit, which they are driven to do by raising the price, what we are doing is taking away access to those items for poor people and keeping them for rich people. The market is an institution that favors the rich. It always has. And that should give you a big clue as to why rich people love markets. That's not because market is some great efficiency engine. It isn't, and it never was. What it is something that distributes in a way that rich people prefer. And I can drive it home by showing you that in American history, we have repeatedly, in the past and right now as you and I are talking, we have broken into that. We have not allowed the market to work because it has been intolerable for the American people to do what I just said, to have a mechanism that distributes something that's scarce to the richest people, not the people who deserve it the most, not the people who need it the most, not the people who will help the community the most. No, not that. Simply those who've got the fattest wallets. They get it, and the rest of us, Watch them get it. So if you allow me, I'd like to tell you the story of 2 or 3 examples, past and present, where we have had alternatives. And I don't mind telling you, I stress this these days because in our mainstream media, and thank God that Pacifica and places like that offer an alternative, in the mainstream media, we're getting a chorus from the Democrats, the Republicans, Mitch McConnell in the Senate, President Biden, Treasury Secretary Yellen, Mr. Powell, the head of the Fed. They're all singing the exact same song in the exact same register, as if raising interest rates is the one, the only, the best. That's what we're talking, as if there were no alternatives. But there are, and they're all around us, and they have been part of American history, and they are now. And to pretend otherwise is weird as a moment in our nation's history. So let me begin. I'm going to start with World War II. Here we are, it's the 1940s, early 40s, and President Roosevelt at the time realizes something, as his advisors do, and as any observer would have. We're fighting a two-front war against the Germans and Italians in Europe, against the Japanese in Asia. That takes a lot of effort, and a great portion of the resources, the productive resources in the United States, are diverted from producing consumer goods, food, clothing, shelter, automobiles, all of that, to making war. They produce uniforms, guns, bullets, ships, tanks, planes, all of that. And they need the railroads to move the parts around, etc. So everyone understands we are now going to be having a relative shortage of consumer goods because the resources are going somewhere else. We're not going to have a cut in demand. People still want to eat. People still want to put clothes on their bodies. They still want to have shelter. They still need their automobiles, et cetera, et cetera. So the demand for consumer goods is going to be more or less the same, but the supply is going down because we're producing for war. Well, now the question arises.
And that's what I mean, just to be very clear here, it's kind of what the situation, at least is talked about, is today. The demand.
Absolutely. We're heading in that direction again. We're not that far. World War II was a bigger effort than supporting Ukraine. But yes.
Well, even beyond the war, I mean, I was just thinking if we're talking about supply chain disruptions and
defense spending that moves resources over there. Remember, everything that is being sent to Ukraine has to be replaced in the American arsenal, and the resources are being diverted as we speak. So in any case, here was their problem. They could let the market handle the situation. That would have meant, to be very concrete, a rich person would have gone to the grocery store and said, I'm here to buy a gallon of milk because I have 5 cats that are dear to me and my home, and they love milk, and I want to give them milk to feed them. But there's not enough milk on the shelf, the storekeeper says, because we are not producing milk since the resources are diverted to war. Okay, says the rich person, I'll tell you what, whatever you're charging for the milk, I'll pay you $1 more. In comes another rich person, watches all this and says, wait a minute, I don't want to be left without my milk. I'll give you $2 more. Okay, now the price of milk is being bid up by wealthy people. In comes Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and they have 5 children, no pets. They want milk for the children, but they're poor, and they can't pay the bid up price of the milk. The storekeeper is happy to sell the milk to the rich because then he gets the high price, which he needs to solve his problems. So the rich people get the scarce milk. The storekeeper gets an income boost, and the poor are screwed. They get no milk, and they have to watch their children do without, while the pets of the rich people get the milk. And the conclusion that the Roosevelt administration reached was, to fight a war, we need a unified population. If we allow the market to work, we're going to have bitterness, envy, hostility. The poor are going to watch as the rich get all the scarce stuff. This is impossible. And so the government of the United States said, we will not allow the market to work. Let me say that again, because Americans have a hard time with this moment of their history. What did the government do? It printed and distributed ration books, they were called. And inside the ration books, there were sets of ration stamps. And the way you bought a quart of milk, or a pound of meat, or a pound of coffee, or a gallon of gasoline for your car, or a whole host of rationed goods, you had to give the storekeeper this stamp. Money was no longer relevant. The market had been changed. And how did the government distribute these books it printed? For those of you with a little bit of history of socialism, you're going to smile now, because the government distributed the books to each American citizen according to the need of that citizen. You had a lot of children, you got a lot of milk stamps.
Was that the language that was used?
Sorry?
Was that the language that was used?
No. They were smart enough to avoid that kind of problem with the quote-unquote conservatives in the population. My point is only, this is a way of distributing scarcity that is not market-driven, that does not favor the rich, that uses a different criterion. We don't distribute what's scarce to the people with the most money. We're taking into account, do you have a large family? Are there many children in it? For example, if you live in a rural area, you need more gasoline than if you live in a place where you can use public transportation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Rational people got together. It's not that what they did was perfect. Every solution to inflation has its problems. But the conversation in America that never brings up that rationing was used for years here in the United States is a testimony to a kind of selective historical amnesia that ought to worry us. Here's a second example. This time it comes from a Republican president, Richard M. Nixon by name. It's August 15th, 1971. There's a raging inflation, worse than the one we have now, going on. Mr. Nixon gets on radio and television, says to the American people, I am determined to stop this inflation. It is hurting this country in 10 different ways. He mentions them, and so it has to stop. And I'm therefore declaring, these were his words, a price wage freeze. That was the name of what he introduced. And here's how it worked, he says. As of tomorrow morning, that would have been the 16th of August, 1971, if you're a business and you raise a price, any price of what you sell, you will be arrested and you will go to jail. And if you're a union or any other worker and you demand or press for higher wages, we will do the same to you. We're freezing for the next 90 days, 3 months, we're freezing all prices, freezing all wages, so that the inflation, the rise in them, comes to an end, which it did. This was a policy that had the desired effect. Now let me give you the third example, because it's going on right now. The first two examples, one was in the war, one was in the 70s. But here's one right now. There are certain commodities in capitalism which are most efficiently produced with only one producer. We call them public utilities. It doesn't make sense for 5 water companies to be running pipes through our streets, so they compete to see which one we'll use to turn the faucet on in our kitchen, right? We don't do that. We have one water company or one company that brings the electric wires in so we have electricity. The problem is when you have only one company, you call that a monopoly, and the one company can, and in the history of capitalism, it always does, sooner or later take advantage of its unique position to jack up its prices. In other words, we now have an inflation of a particular commodity because of the position of the companies who can do this. What did we do as a nation? What are we doing right now? Here's the answer. In every one of the 50 states in this country, there is something called a Public Utility Commission. And here's how it works. If you're a public utility, a water company, an electric company, used to be the telephone company, a variety, you can't raise your price when you want to. You have to go before the commission. You have to show them your books, and you have to justify that any proposed price increase is reasonable. And the commission has the power to say, yes, we agree, you can do it, or no, we don't agree, you can't do it, or some compromise between those two. In other words, prices are controlled. They're not freely raisable by the minority of employers. They have to go before a public commission that is seated through the decisions of publicly responsible, elected, accountable officials. Here's another example, the insurance business. There were scandals. Insurance companies were charging wild amounts of money, and so we have insurance commissions in most states so that they do the same thing. Before an insurance company can raise the premium you have to pay every year, they have to go and convince a commission. Okay, we could do that with every commodity, with a subset of commodities. We might say, for example, that food is such a basic requirement of human beings that we're going to deal with food inflation differently from dealing with the inflation, say, of luxury goods. Food is something, we die in a short time if we cannot replenish our bodies with food. And so we would have a control over that. Other countries do it. And as I say, we already have precedent for doing it with other things that are basic, like utilities and insurance and so on. My problem that I want to stress with you, Mitch, is not one or the other of these proposals. All of them have strengths, all of them have weaknesses, but so do the proposals now being discussed as if they're the only way to go of raising interest rates. They have strengths and weaknesses too. And I might mention that if you raise interest rates, you'll make the purchase of a home more expensive because your mortgage payments go up. You make the purchase of a car more expensive because your monthly payments go up. You make carrying a balance on your credit card more expensive because they charge higher interest on your balance. And students will have to pay more as they borrow money, especially since the government is not giving them the relief that was promised. So you put it all together, raising interest rates hurts everybody who must borrow. And Americans are deeper in debt than we have ever been. So this is going to hurt us a lot. And that ought to be a question. Do you really want to do that? Pandemic, economic crash, inflation, and now you whack them with an interest. I mean, why are we surprised that the working class of this country is bitter, is angry, is looking for scapegoats to blame, and all the rest that we observe around us? We have an economic system that isn't working for the mass of people, and we should not be surprised as the anger at this display builds and the impatience with a government that acts as though there aren't policy options when there are, when our own history teaches us about them, makes you really shake your head and wonder.
That's all fascinating. And going back to such things as the rationing books of World War II, and then what Richard Nixon did in freezing both prices and wages for 3 months, living in a society today in which having to wear a mask seems to be an infringement on one's freedom. It just seems, and it seems if we were to do those kind of things, maybe it's a little more complicated and nuanced when you talk about utilities, but those other kind of things, it just seems to be almost something that people would be up in arms about if and scream socialism, these kind of things, if that were to happen.
Well, yes and no. Let me give you a different way of seeing it. For me, I've been wondering, like so many Americans, why is there this kind of strange assertion of freedom to not wear a mask or to not get vaccinated or any of these other things? What is this about? And my wife, whom you know, who is a psychologist, she explains it to me and gives me the concept displacement. And here's what she means. We all know the kind of story because it shows up in situation comedies all the time. Some overworked husband or wife comes home from their difficult day on the job, and they throw something at the dog who's barking, and then they have a moment of regret when they realize the dog isn't the problem, and the dog is doing what dogs do, and they love the dog, and the dog loves it. What in the world are they doing? And the answer is they're displacing. They're taking the tension and upset built up during the day in a different place, but expressing it or relieving themselves by doing something to an innocent that they shouldn't have done, and they're at least decent enough to recognize it. Here's my suspicion. The economy is like walls closing in on us, closing off options, depriving us of the freedom to travel, the freedom to explore, the freedom to treat ourselves, even in little ways, because the budget is squeezing us. And then someone comes along and says, well, here's this mask you should wear, and you blow up like that person at the dog. No, I won't, my free. I remember when I first encountered people doing that, I said to them, every time you cross an intersection in your car, there's a red light. You stop. Your freedom to go through that intersection is blocked. But you don't seem to get upset at all. You put your foot on the brake. You wait 30, 50, 60 seconds till the light changes to green, and then you go through. And if you ever even think about it, you realize that this is for your own good, because it means the people going the other way can move across the intersection while you're standing, and then you can move while they're standing. It all kind of makes sense. But your freedom to drive where and when you want is being constricted. And I tried to get across to people, you don't object to that, but you don't want to wear a mask. What is this with your freedom? And I've never gotten each time I do that, people look at me a little bit like the proverbial puppy. They don't know what you're talking about, but they know you're talking to them. I'm trying to explain it. They don't want to hear it because they're angry. And by the way, I respect the anger. The anger comes from a real place. Just like the person who threw something at their dog, they have real grievances about how they were treated on the job. There's something real going on that ought to be attended to. But that's different from justifying the irrational displacement that's going on. And so I wonder if we really did something about people's financial and economic suffering, they might be a lot less resistant to being told, get vaccinated, get a mask. This is like going through an intersection only when the light is green. And they would accept it too, because they wouldn't be so pressed in everywhere else in their lives.
Joe Biden, in his remarks yesterday about inflation, I thought it was going to be a major policy speech. It was really just reiterating things that have already been said before. But he did say the two drivers of inflation were the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. What's your reaction to that?
Um, that is pure blame somebody else. I mean, it's awful. Look, those who want to blame Mr. Biden, I criticize them too. He's not the beginning and end of the story for sure. But his pointing to the war or to the pandemic, that is just, I mean, that's somewhere between outrageous and pathetic. Let me explain. First, the inflation started a year ago. The invasion of Russia into Ukraine happened on the 24th of February. Just the dates alone indicate that to blame the war for the inflation makes no sense, number one. And number two, the war, that is the military conflict between Russia on the one hand and Ukraine on the other, is not what is making the inflation worse. What is making the inflation worse is the basket of sanctions led by the United States, imposed on Russia, imposed on people in other countries that are dealing with Russia. That is causing all kinds of disruptions that are opportunity, for companies to raise prices. So to be honest, it isn't a war. Look, for better or worse, and it's horrible, of course, what's happening in Ukraine to the people there, but the war itself would have marginal effects on prices. It would affect maybe the goods coming out of Ukraine. And the Ukraine does produce a significant amount of grain and so, but Ukraine is a small, poor country. Let's be real clear. For example, I'll get one statistic. The GDP, the total output of goods and services in Ukraine last year, before the war, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 trillion. So roughly 500 billion. $1.5 trillion. The GDP of the United States, $21 trillion. Do you understand that this is 2% of the American economy? And we don't depend on hardly anything that comes from Ukraine. So you're not going to explain what's going on in the United States, certainly not a general inflation, by anything, good, bad, or indifferent, that happens in Ukraine. And Russia's export capability has not been damaged by its invasion. It has been damaged by the sanctions, but the sanctions are led, and overwhelmingly the bulk of sanctions come from the United States. They are the policy of Mr. Biden. He was told by his advisors, by the way, I know this because I know some of them. He was told by his advisors that doing this would, in fact, worsen the inflation, something that every economist could have told him as well. The government is suddenly spending a lot of money. A lot of goods are going to be disrupted. A lot of trade routes have to be rearranged. All of that costs more money, and that will lead businesses, rightly or wrongly, to use the moment as an opportunity to jack up prices since they were going up anyway. That was clear. And so, to be honest, he should have said that. And the same is true with this endless story. It really, I hope you don't mind, I express a little bit my passion here. This nonsense about long supply chains. That's right. Goods that we now buy here in the United States come a long way. That is, they're produced far away and they have to come a long distance. But hello, the companies that do that, half the goods from China come from subsidiaries of American and other Western countries. They're Chinese workers, but the company is owned by American, British, French, Italian, German, Japanese corporations. And they all did it. That is, they moved to China, or for the same reason they moved to India or Vietnam or Brazil or many other places, because it was profitable. They could get away with paying much lower wages over there compared to what they had to pay Americans. So they went there because the wages were so low that even after you added the cost of bringing those goods all the way back on those long supply chains, it was still more profitable. The travel, the freight was less than what you saved on wages. So the corporations went there of their own free will by virtue of the profit they got. No one held a gun to their heads. That's why they went. And by the way, just a footnote, the Chinese were crystal clear. We want you to come. We want you to create jobs for Chinese workers. We will come here. We will supply you with low-wage Chinese workers. They're well-educated. They're well-disciplined. You will like them, which is what happened. Number two, we will give you access to the Chinese market. It is the fastest growing market for goods and services in the world, partly because it's the biggest country in the world, but it's one that's rising fast. So you get cheap labor and access to the world's best growing market. In exchange, we want you to share your technology, your business methods. You have things to teach us. That's the deal. You don't have to take it. We can't force you. But if you want the profits, you got to share. The corporations went one after another because it was a good deal for them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone. It is really sour grapes and really dishonest to then turn around, having made this deal, and accuse the Chinese of proper intellectual property theft. Oh, gosh, that's dirty pool. That's a kind of behavior that the world knows, and it does the United States' reputation no good to play this game. In any case, if you're going to have a long supply chain, here's what every business man and woman knows. That can be disrupted. Look, a short supply chain can be disrupted. There can be a flood. There can be a storm. There can be an electric outage. There can be civil unrest. There can be change of government. There can be war. I mean, there's all these things that disrupt supply lines. The longer the supply line, the more disruptions are potentially available. What do? Every business knows this. You have to create warehouses along the way where you stock stuff so that if you can't deliver because of a disruption in a supply chain, you have strategically located warehouses where you can keep your customer happy by using up your inventory to deliver what you're committed to while you fix the disruption. Here's the problem. Those corporations that went didn't want to sacrifice their profits to build the requisite warehouses. You know, the best example of that, if you remember some months ago, there was a ship that went aground in the Suez Canal, and it blocked the whole canal because it had to be straightened out. And the problem there wasn't that a ship got caught. That happens in every canal from time to time. What you need to do is have in place mechanisms to offload the freight so you go around the obstruction. I mean, come on, this is not rocket science. To blame the disruptions is an attempt to avoid accepting the responsibility that you as a corporate genius forgot, or more honestly, didn't want to spend the money to do what has to be done when you have made profits by lengthening your supply chain. And my appeal to all of you is, don't be fooled. This is just corporate PR trying to blame somebody else.
Last question. We're almost out of time. But what about the money that the government spent during the pandemic and the stimulus checks that came out and the tax credit for children, food stamps? It was, I don't know if it was quite unprecedented. It wasn't quite the New Deal, but at least for our more modern era, last 30, 40, 50 years, it's pretty extraordinary what happened during the pandemic and government spending. I suspect, because the inflation that followed afterwards, it's going to actually hurt attempts in the future for government spending on people in the future. Do you think there is a connection to the money that the government spent during the pandemic and the inflation we're experiencing now?
Probably there is some connection. You can always make that case. You can't really refute it. You did increase government spending massively. We had $1 trillion deficits, etc. And people should know that the stimulus that the government did during 2020 and 2021 was about 3 times larger than what it did back in 2008 and 9, which was the last time we had a huge crash where the government had to come in. And we ought to think about what it means that in this new century, barely 22 years old, we've had 3 major crashes. .com in 2000, subprime mortgage in 2008, so-called COVID-19 last year and the year before. These crashes, each one worse than the one before, much worse, required much more government to save us, to keep this economy from literally collapsing. The government had no choice. The private sector collapsed. And if the government had not stepped in, we would have had a level of economic contraction and civil and social unrest beyond anything that we have seen. And the government knew that, and it stepped in a massive way. And looking back, there will always be those who say, well, yes, that contributed to the inflation later, to which the answer will always be, and yeah, if we didn't do that, inflation would be the least of our worries, because we would have had a crashed 1930s, and that at this day and age is not it's not really an option that you can do. But even having said all that, let me just recoup what we've just done. You can deal with an inflation. It is fundamentally easily managed. There are a variety of tools. Some of them favor this part of the population. Some of them favor that one. The one that we have unanimity of the government now, Republicans, Democrats, Federal Reserve, and everybody else, is the one that uses the market that favors the rich. And they're pretending that those are the only ones. Nobody should be fooled or to believe that our only choice is to do what they do or simply suffer an inflation that is also something that favors the rich who can handle it over against the middle and the poor who take it on the chin.
Richard Wolff has been our guest. Again, Richard Wolff is a professor of economics at the New School University in New York. He is the host of the radio and TV program, Economic Update. You can find his work at democracyatwork.info. Professor Wolff, as always, I thank you.
Thank you, Mitch, and I hope I didn't talk too much, but these are very hot topics for all of us, and particularly those of us who follow the economy.